Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Chester Arthur, and the focus is on Machine VP and the assassination of the president. The year is 1880, and Chester Arthur is the Vice President-elect of the United States, and he is thrilled at this notion. Now, most people who had held this job as Vice President didn't care for it very much. There wasn't a lot for them to actually do. Many thought it was actually a horrible job because they weren't embraced typically by the executive branch and the president. Their only real responsibilities was in the legislative branch as the president of the Senate, but all they could do there was preside and break ties. They couldn't engage in any senatorial debate. So most didn't care much for this job. But for Chester Arthur, this was perfect. It was all going to be great fun. Ceremonial honors would come with this. There weren't terribly a lot of responsibilities. He didn't want to be president and all that work. He loved the notion, though, of being respected and honored as the vice president of the United States. And besides, his loyalty wasn't really changing. His boss politically wasn't going to be James Garfield, the president of the United States. It was going to still be Roscoe Conkling, the man who had been his political boss in New York for all these years. Nothing was changing as far as Vice President-elect Chester Arthur was concerned. And this was evident pretty early on as Garfield, the president-elect, is trying to come up with his cabinet, trying to balance all these competing factions in the Republican Party. And he was really struggling to do so. The first domino fell when he picked for the top spot in the cabinet, Secretary of State. He went with James Blaine of Maine, his former colleague in the House. He admired and respected. The problem was in the party, Blaine and Conkling were at the opposite ends of the party. They were politically estranged, political enemies, in fact. And when Conkling heard that Blaine got this top spot, he was outraged after all that he had done in New York to help put Garfield over the top for the presidency. He was worried that Blaine was actually going to control Garfield, own the patronage decisions. This was not going to be good for the machine. Well, Garfield was caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy. And to Blaine, he floated the idea, how about this? What if we bring Conkling into the cabinet? Blaine said, sir, absolutely not. He told the president-elect that would act like strychnine upon your administration. First bring contortions and then be followed by death. Nothing subtle about James Blaine. Roscoe Conkling had reason to be worried. Well, just before the inauguration, Garfield finalized his cabinet. All New York got was the Postmaster General, the lowest rung at the time in the cabinet, and Garfield, or rather Conkling, was outraged. He grabbed Vice President-elect Chester Arthur and converged on Garfield's hotel. Garfield was there in his room. He sat at the edge of his bed, silently listening to Conkling berate him for a full hour before Conkling finally ran out of steam. When he was done, Garfield stood up, didn't say a word, walked out of the room, and nothing was going to change. Inauguration Day. Well, Chester Arthur took his oath of office first as vice president. That took place in the Senate chamber. Everyone else went out after that to the east front of the Capitol, where James Garfield was sworn in as the president. A festive night for all that night at the new National Museum on the Washington Mall. This was a fun day, maybe the last fun, peaceful day in the entire presidency of James Garfield. This was all about patronage, making those decisions on who got what job, because that meant power, and it was Roscoe Conkling against James Blaine trying to influence the new president, James Garfield. Conkling went to the White House just a couple of weeks later and met with Garfield because Garfield still wanted to have Conkling on his side. And Garfield agreed. 5 names to 5 key positions would be nominated that Conkling had put forward in this meeting. Garfield sent those off to the Senate. Now, Blaine was really upset about this, so they're going back and forth as well. And Garfield was going to cave to someone, frankly, typically the last person that had his ear. And this time, Blaine came up with a concocted scheme to really get at Roscoe Conkling. The prize position in all of New York, of course, was the collector of the New York Custom House, the job that Chester Arthur had had just a couple of years before. Now, Conkling, though, did not put that on the table in his meeting with Garfield because Edwin Merritt was in that job. He had a couple of years left to go on his term. He figured he would deal with that later. But not James Blaine. He decided to go after the collectorship of the Custom House right then and there. He wanted William Robertson, his guy, as collector. So what would he do with Edwin Merritt? here's how the scheme went. He told the president, James Garfield, just take Merritt out of there and make him the consul general in London. Well, what would you do with Adam Badeau, who happened to be Ulysses Grant's main man? Adam Badeau was in that job in London. What would you do with him? Oh, don't worry about that. We'll just send him to Denmark. Well, he'll be minister there. Well, what are you going to do with Michael Kramer? He was in that job. Don't worry about that. We'll just send him to Switzerland. 1, 2, 3 steps after another, and James Garfield actually said okay. He threw his arms up. He had basically lost control of his administration. He took these nominations and sent them off to the United States Senate, basically confirming in Roscoe Conkling and Ulysses Grant's mind that he was simply a puppet of James Blaine. Both Conkling and Grant completely broke with the president. Now, Garfield's sad about all this. He decided one last chance with Conkling. I'm going to invite him to a dinner party at the White House, and we'll try to work this out. Conkling agreed to come. And then he did same thing he had done during the campaign. He stiffed the President of the United States in this case. He kept him waiting an hour and a half before he finally sent word, I'm not coming. So what did Garfield do? Well, he then drew the line in the sand. He said that this Robertson nomination for the collectorship in New York would be to settle the question whether the president is registering clerk of the Senate or the executive of the United States. Robertson may be carried out of the Senate head first or feet first. I shall never withdraw him. Chester Arthur tried to mediate this, but again, he had very little influence on the president in his current role. Garfield wasn't changing, and Chester Arthur actually put into words some of his own personal disappointment because he thought he had heard during the campaign that Garfield was going to give them the patronage stuff in New York if the machine came out to support them. As far as Arthur was concerned, it is a hard thing to say of a president, but it is unfortunately only the truth. Garfield, spurred by Blaine, by whom he is easily led, has broke every pledge made to us, and not only that, he seems to have wished to do it in the most offensive way. Now, Arthur was still standing by his boss, Roscoe Conkling, in all of this, but again, he had no influence in trying to get the president to make a move. Well, later that month, everything shifted to the United States Senate to see how this battle was going to play itself out to take up these nominations from the president. And Roscoe Conkling, who still had strong power in the Senate, decided to put everything on the line, push really hard to keep these nominations from going through. But the fact is, Conkling had really ticked off a lot of people over the years. Not only were the Democrats against him, but even some of the Republicans were tired of Roscoe Conkling. And in the end, Conkling lost out. All of these men were confirmed by the United States Senate, and Conkling and his machine were basically in trouble. They were hanging on by a thread. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And what did that mean? Senator Thomas Platt, the other senator from New York, came up with an idea which can indeed be called a desperate measure. His idea was that he and Roscoe Conkling would resign from the United States Senate. Now, why would they do that? Well, in their mind, they would simply then go back to the state legislature in New York. The legislature would reappoint them to the Senate. They would both come back to Washington, D.C. This would be an embarrassing, a humiliating event for the President of the United States, a bold rebuke by the big state of New York against James Garfield. But there was a lot of risk in doing this, and Chester Arthur was among those who were advising Roscoe Conkling, don't do this, too much risk. But Conkling eventually agreed. He felt he had no choice. He needed to do something bold. He agreed to resign with Platt in a move that turned out to be a complete disaster. Now, as president of the Senate, Chester Arthur made this announcement official in front of his Senate members on May the 14th of 1881. He shocked them all by saying it was the resignation of Conkling and of Platt. People thought this was a crazy move, but they were convinced that they were going to be right. The question was, what was Chester Arthur going to do? He's the vice president of the United States, but again, no matter to him, his boss was still Roscoe Conkling. He decided to travel with Conkling and Platt to Albany to help organize, get them reelected. Now, this was very unseemly to a lot of people around the country for a vice president of the United States to do this. this? The New York Tribune wrote that it is not enough to say that no one of them, former vice presidents, was ever guilty of such an impropriety as this. It would never have been possible for one of them to conceive of such a gross lapse of dignity. If General Arthur does not desire 4 years of public contempt, he would do well to desist from the business in which he is now engaged before his inexcusable indiscretion becomes a national scandal. Political cartoonist Thomas Nast took this to the next level. He portrayed Arthur as a subservient bootblack for Conkling and Platt in a cartoon entitled Outshining Everybody in Humiliation at Albany. Well, Chester Arthur was hurt by this cartoon on many levels, actually. We know this because he met with Nast a couple of years later when he was president, and he admitted that it hurt me. It hurt me terribly. Yet you were right, far more so than you knew. He told Nast, I did so far descend from the dignity of my office as to go to see Platt and Conkling. But it is worse than that, much worse. I went to Albany that last time because they sent for me to come. I went on their order to come and explain why I had not made good my pledge. I humbled myself for not having been able to keep my plighted faith. Now you understand why your picture was even truer than you could know. He knew what was going on, but at the time, he worked round the clock to rally support for Roscoe Conkling in Albany. But Conkling was not only lacking some of that support in the U.S. Senate, he was lacking the support that he thought he had in the state legislature in New York. He had political enemies there as well, and there were no fewer than 20 candidates who were put forward on the first day for the balloting for both Senate positions. They took the vote. No one had a majority, not Conkling, not Platt, not anyone else. Now, the rules in New York at the time, if a Senate open was like this, they had to vote at least once every single day until that spot was filled, and that's what happened. Day after day, week after week. Thomas Platt, about a month in, actually dropped out of the race. It was not for political reasons. It was because he was found with another man's wife in his hotel room. That was enough for him to give up. But Roscoe Conkling kept going. All of this, though, came to an abrupt interruption on July 2nd, 1881, when they heard word that an assassination attempt had taken place in Washington, D.C. on President Garfield. An deranged office seeker by the name of Charles Guiteau had fired 2 shots into the back of Garfield at a D.C. train station. He had been angry about not getting a job he felt he had deserved, and he believed he would find salvation with Roscoe Conkling and his stalwarts, as his followers were called, the stalwarts in the political machine. He thought this was the alternative to help, and he was going to put Chester Arthur in the White House. When he was arrested after the shooting, Guiteau claimed, I did it and will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur will be president. Well, Arthur was with Roscoe Conkling in New York City when he got word of the assassination attempt, and Chester Arthur was terrified. Not only was he worried about Garfield, he was worried about himself. He had no interest in being the president. He knew, frankly, he wasn't qualified. That was real work, hard work. It was not like being the vice president of the United States at all. Chester Arthur was paralyzed with fear over the prospect that he might be about to become the president of the United States. Well, that night he received a number of telegrams from the cabinet. The news was not good about Garfield here on the first evening. He was told, you got to come to Washington as soon as possible. He got on a train, went to the Capitol the next day, went to the White House. Now, as Garfield's doctors did not allow him to see James Garfield, the wounded president who was in an upstairs bedroom. He did see Mrs. Garfield, where he spoke with her for a little bit, but then he excused himself and he basically hung out in D.C. quietly, silently for a couple of days while Garfield started to actually improve. And after several days of this, Arthur was confident that Garfield was going to make it. I can leave the Capitol, head back to New York, kind of hide out, hope for the best, and please, Mr. President, survive because I don't want to be president. Well, at the time, there was concern not only from Chester Arthur's mind about the prospect of him becoming president, there were others who were concerned as well. According to the Chicago Tribune, if anything could add to the universal grief of the American people over the attempted assassination of President Garfield, the anticipation of 3.5 years government under Mr. Arthur and all which that implies will be by the American people generally accepted as a pending calamity of the utmost magnitude. There were other opinions along these lines as well, including the U.S. ambassador to Germany, Andrew White. He said at the time it was a common saying at the time among those who knew him best, Chet Arthur for President of the United States? Good God. There was one other person who was opining on this quietly behind the scenes and beginning a letter-writing campaign to the President of the United States, or the man who was about to be President of the United States. This woman's name was Julia Sand. She was 31 years old and she was an invalid. She was ill. She could barely get out of bed at times, could almost never leave her home, but she was politically aware. And she decided to start writing letters to Chester Arthur, and she had a really interesting style. She was aggressive, no holds barred, but she would basically try to knock down Arthur and then try to build him back up. And on August the 27th, she wrote the first of 23 letters to Arthur, and this is how it started. The hours of Garfield's life are numbered. Before this meets your eye, you may be president. The people are bowed in grief, but do you realize it? Not so much because he is dying as because you are his successor. This is the knocking down part, but then Julia Sand pivoted in the letter to the uplifting component. She continued that great emergencies awaken generous traits which have lain dormant half a life. If there is a spark of true nobility in you, now is the occasion to let it shine. Rise to the emergency. Disappoint our fears. Force the nation to have faith in you. Show from the first that you have none but the purest aims. It may be difficult at once to inspire confidence, but persevere. What will posterity say? It is for you to choose whether your record shall be written in black or gold. Chester Arthur kept this letter. Perhaps it weighed on him as he was thinking about what to do. Well, in mid-July, meanwhile, James Garfield started to go downhill. It wasn't the bullet from Charles Guiteau that actually ended up in his death. It was his treatment. The prodding, the unsanitary prodding by the doctors trying to find that bullet. What did it do? It just introduced germs. The idea of antisepsis had actually been put forward in Europe over a decade before, but it had not been embraced in the United States. So the unsanitary nature of all this poking and prodding introduced massive infection into Garfield's body. It spread throughout the body, and on September 20th of 1881, James Garfield died. What did that mean? The career spoilsman with no political ideology, no interest in being President of the United States, only fear of that prospect, Chester Arthur, was now going to be the leader of 50 million people as he was about to be sworn in as the President of the United States. We'll find out how that goes in a future episode. For now, that is Chester Arthur and a machine VP and the assassination of the president from the life of Chester Arthur. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.